was 1853, and New York was changing faster than anyone could make sense of. Factories belched smoke into a gray sky. Carriages rattled down muddy cobblestone streets. Beneath layers of lace and manners, the city pulsed with superstition and quiet fear. Fear of disease, of death, of being forgotten. In a small, wind-bitten town on the edge of the Hudson, people whispered about a young woman whose story didn't belong to the living. They said she was a bride twice promised, once to a man and once to the grave. No one remembered her name with certainty. Some called her Clara, others said she was Margaret or Eliza. But all agreed on the same thing. She had loved deeply, waited faithfully, and lost everything before the bells of her wedding could ring. Her fiancé, a young merchant's son, had fallen ill weeks before their marriage. The sickness came suddenly, like winter striking too early. He was gone before she could say goodbye. They buried him on a hill that overlooked the town, where the fog often drifted like a living thing. In the days after the funeral, the bride-to-be was never seen without her veil. She stopped eating, stopped speaking, and began writing letters to him. People said she left them folded in the graveyard gate, sealed with black wax. At first, the townsfolk pitied her. Then they began to avoid her. She wandered the churchyard at night, barefoot in her wedding gown, her lantern swinging weakly through the mist. When the minister tried to speak to her, she only smiled faintly and asked, "If love is eternal, then why does death end it?" That winter, the town fell into a kind of silence that felt unnatural. Cattle refused to cross certain fields. The church bell, once bright and proud, cracked down its middle during a storm. And then, one night in December, a rumor began to spread like frost. She had gone through with it. The ceremony, a wedding no living man attended. The story came from the gravedigger's apprentice, a boy no older than 14. He swore he saw candlelight between the headstones near midnight, heard music, a waltz, faint and off-key, drifting from the old chapel that had been locked for years. When he crept close enough to look through the cracked door, he claimed he saw her there, standing beside a coffin dressed in white, her veil drawn low, a priest murmuring words too old to belong to the living. And on the coffin lid lay a ring. By morning, the chapel was empty again. Only wax drippings on the altar and a trail of wet footprints led out to the graveyard. The next day, she was found lying in the snow, pale and still, her fingers wrapped tightly around a man's hand, though there was no man beside her. The doctor said her heart had simply stopped. The townspeople said otherwise. Some whispered that she had been taken, others that she had crossed the threshold willingly. The newspapers never printed her name. The church refused to hold a funeral, but there were those who claimed, years later, that on cold nights, when fog rolled in from the river, they could still hear faint music coming from that ruined chapel, a single violin playing a wedding march for no one. Historians would later call it the bride who married a corpse, one of the strangest stories to come out of pre-Civil War New York. But what few realize is that the tale didn't end with her death. In parish records, there's a second entry, written weeks later by the same priest said to have presided over that midnight ceremony. The ink is smudged, the words barely legible, but one line remains clear. The union is complete. May God forgive what was done. And so her story begins not with life, but with the moment she refused to accept death. In a time when grief was considered holy and madness a kind of possession, this woman crossed both boundaries. She stood before the altar, trembling and silent, and said vows that no living soul should ever speak. Those who study her case now, historians, psychologists, theologians, argue endlessly about what really happened. Was it grief that drove her? A delusion born of mourning and isolation? Or something far older, a ritual remembered from the old world, where people believed love could summon back the dead? Whatever the answer, one thing remains true. That night in 1853, under the frozen light of a New York moon, a bride kept her promise, and some say she still does. Mid-19th century New York was a land caught between faith and science, where mourning was not only expected, it was performed. The country was still young, and so was its fascination with death. Families posed for photographs with their deceased children. Poets wrote odes to the afterlife, and parlors were draped in black crepe for months after a loss. To the people of that time, grief was not a private wound. It was a social identity. The mourning bride, as some newspapers called her, was not an anomaly in spirit. only in how far she took the ritual. In 1853, the year she lived and died, New York was changing fast. The Erie Canal had made trade flourish, and industrial smoke drifted over what had once been farmland. Steamships lined the Hudson. Telegraph lines began to thread across the landscape, carrying messages faster than thought had ever traveled. But for all its modern progress, the human heart remained rooted in superstition. Death was everywhere, and yet no one truly understood it. Epidemics of cholera, diphtheria, and yellow fever had swept through the state in waves. In many towns, cemeteries grew faster than schools. There was no germ theory yet, only whispers of bad air and divine punishment. The line between science and religion blurred. Doctors spoke of nervous fevers and female hysteria, while pastors preached about souls trapped between heaven and earth. Women, in particular, bore the heaviest weight of grief. A bride's purity, her devotion, and her silence were prized above all. When a woman lost her betrothed, she was expected to mourn him completely, to dress in black, avoid company, and carry the memory like a sacred relic. To stop grieving too soon was indecent. To grieve too long was insanity. Somewhere in that fragile balance, our unnamed bride lived her final days. She came from a modest family, one of many struggling to hold dignity in a rapidly industrializing America. Her father likely worked in trade or shipping. Her mother, a devout woman, would have taught her that obedience and faith were her truest virtues. The church was the center of everything: birth, marriage, death, all bound by ritual. And rituals had power. Victorian mourning customs bordered on the obsessive. Locks of hair were braided into jewelry. Portraits of the dead were painted with lifelike eyes. Windows were covered in thick drapery to keep sunlight from disturbing spirits said to linger for weeks. It was believed that the dead could hear the prayers of the living if spoken close enough to the grave. Some even set an empty chair at the dining table for the departed, believing their souls still visited at dusk into this world of reverence and dread. The young bride's tragedy fit perfectly and terribly. Her fiancé's death would have cast her into a long season of public mourning. The wedding dress, once a symbol of joy, became a haunting reminder. In some communities, brides in mourning were encouraged to destroy the gown, to cut it to ribbons, burn it, or bury it with the deceased. But she did none of that. She kept hers clean, folded, waiting. The act alone would have unsettled her neighbors. In small towns of the time, where privacy was a myth, even a silent defiance could echo like a scandal. And yet she lived quietly, obeying every visible rule of grief, except one. She refused to let go. During those years, spiritualism was spreading through the United States. Seances were becoming popular, especially among the grieving. Mediums claimed to speak with the dead through knocks, raps, and trances. Newspapers printed accounts of ghostly photographs and voices from beyond. It was a strange comfort in an age of loss. If science couldn't defeat death, perhaps communication could bridge it. New York in particular was at the center of this movement. Upstate, the Fox sisters had claimed to contact spirits, their seances drawing crowds eager for proof of the afterlife. By 1853, gatherings to summon the dead were not only accepted, they were fashionable among certain circles. It is entirely possible that the bride, or someone close to her, attended one of these seances, or at least heard of them. The idea that her lost fiancé could be reached, spoken to, felt, would not have seemed impossible. This intersection of grief and faith, science and superstition, built the stage for what came next. A society obsessed with death had given her all the tools she needed to believe that love could override mortality. The prayers, the rituals, the nights spent by the grave, none of it was madness to her world. It was devotion, yet beneath that devotion was something darker. The same beliefs that comforted mourners also imprisoned them. The church taught that the dead waited in heaven, yet the spiritualists promised they lingered nearby. Science dismissed both as fantasy and yet offered no solace of its own. In that confusion, people clung to any certainty they could find. For the bride, the only certainty left was the promise she'd made, "Till death do us part." But what if she decided death didn't have the right to part them? Local records from that winter mentioned strange events in the region: a rash of fainting spells, fevers with no known cause, livestock found wandering at night. Some townsfolk linked it to the cold, others to an ill wind off the river. One pastor's diary from nearby Ossining mentions, a young woman who speaks to no one and walks with a lantern by the graves. He describes her as in mourning, yet bridal in spirit. That single line, half observation, half warning, captures the tension of the time. Her story was never meant to survive in records. The newspapers of the day rarely printed tales that reflected badly on religion or propriety. But whispers carried farther than ink. By the end of 1853, every small town along the Hudson had its own version of her legend. The woman who refused to bury love, who brought her vows to the grave, who blurred the line between devotion and desecration. To the people of that century, her act was both terrifying and sacred, a defiance of natural law, yet also an affirmation of what they most feared to lose: connection. Theirs was a world where faith lived side by side with the macabre, where a funeral could be beautiful and horrifying at once, and somewhere within that fragile, candle-lit world, a bride stood alone in a chapel, veil trembling, waiting for a groom who would never breathe again. In that moment, she wasn't just a woman in mourning. She was a reflection of her time, a time that worshipped both God and the grave. The days that followed her fiancé's burial were quiet in a way that unsettled even the most practical of neighbors. The house she lived in, an old wooden structure at the edge of the town's frozen orchard, seemed to absorb the silence around it. Curtains remained drawn, lamps burned long past midnight, and sometimes in the stillest hours before dawn, faint humming could be heard through the frost-lined windows. It wasn't a tune anyone recognized. Some thought it might have been a lullaby. Others said it was a hymn. Snow came early that winter. It fell in sheets, erasing footsteps before morning. But one night, the local constable noticed a single set of prints leading from her porch to the graveyard hill, the small lantern glow swaying ahead like a ghostly star. He followed only as far as the old stone bridge, then stopped. The air was thick and wet with fog. He later swore he heard two voices, hers and another answering faintly beneath the ground. He left without looking back. Inside her home, the world was shrinking. She had closed off most of the rooms, keeping only one lit. The parlor had been turned into a kind of shrine, candles melted to glass dishes, her wedding veil draped over the back of a chair, the mirror covered in black cloth. A framed daguerreotype of her fiancé rested on the mantel, its surface tarnished to a dull blue. Every night she sat before it, reading aloud from a prayer book until her voice broke into whispers. Neighbors began to avoid passing by. The house gave off a strange odor, iron and lilies, the scent of old water left standing too long. Even the birds stopped nesting near the roof. Yet she remained polite when seen, offering brief nods, speaking little. Her eyes, once described as clear and kind, now seemed fixed on something far beyond the room she occupied. As the year's final weeks passed, small disturbances began to ripple through the town. The bell in the chapel rang without cause one morning, its rope untouched. Candles left on altars melted unevenly, as if disturbed by a breath. The undertaker's wife claimed she saw movement behind the frost-covered chapel windows, a pale figure walking slowly between pews, her train dragging behind her. The door had been locked for years. In early December, she visited the churchyard daily. Some days she brought flowers. Others, she carried folded pages pressed close to her chest. Witnesses described her as calm, almost serene, her footsteps deliberate. But once, during a snowfall, the gravedigger's boy swore he saw her kneeling beside the mound, her hands sunk deep into the frozen soil, whispering something over and over in a low, rhythmic tone. He ran home, crying that the earth had moved beneath her palms. That same night, she lit every candle in her parlor. The glow seeped through the curtains, turning the house into a faint orange silhouette against the white snow. No one saw her again for 3 days. When the minister called on her at the family's request, he found the door unlocked. Inside, the air was thick and strange. The scent of flowers, white roses, fresh and impossible for the season, clung to everything. Her dress hung near the hearth, pressed and spotless, though the fire had long since died. On the table, a small note in elegant script read only, "The ceremony must be completed." Later that week, during the coldest night of the year, something drew the townspeople from their beds. A faint light flickered up on the hill where the old chapel stood. At first, they thought it was lightning, but it came again, soft, steady, and pulsing like a heartbeat. Some claimed to hear music, the thin echo of a violin played far away. Others insisted it was the wind through broken glass. When a few men climbed the hill to investigate, the snow was unmarked except for a single line of footprints, small, delicate, and recent. The chapel door, though sealed with rust, stood ajar. Inside, the air was cold but not still. Candle smoke curled toward the rafters, and faint traces of salt covered the altar rail. They found no one there. Only her veil lay folded on the step, and beside it, a ring. By morning, word spread that she was gone. Her bed untouched, her belongings neatly arranged as if for departure. The constable searched every barn and riverbank, but the snow had erased all trace. Some said she had gone north toward her fiancé's hometown. Others believed she had simply wandered into the storm and succumbed to the cold. But the gravedigger, the same boy who had once heard her whispering, told a different story. He claimed he saw her once more, at dawn, walking between headstones, her gown bright against the gray. She stopped at one grave, bent low, and then disappeared, not behind stone or tree, but into the earth itself. In the days that followed, unease settled over the community. Children refused to go near the churchyard. Dogs howled when the wind turned east. The chapel bell, silent for years, tolled once at midnight and shattered where it hung. The minister who found the broken bell later described the air as thick with something that did not belong to the living. Winter tightened its hold. The snow turned crusted and gray. Yet on some mornings the townsfolk found new flowers laid upon her fiancé's grave, white roses, their petals unmarked by frost. No one could explain how they arrived or who placed them there. The undertaker, a man with no patience for ghost stories, dismissed it all as hysteria until he was called to inspect a disturbance near the burial ground. The earth above the merchant's son's grave had sunk in, as if disturbed from below. When they dug to repair it, they found the coffin still sealed, but the ring that had been buried with him was missing. The minister ordered the grave filled again before dark. By then, even the most skeptical among them avoided speaking her name. In a place where superstition was dismissed as childish, fear had grown real enough to silence. A single widow's lamp still burned each night in her abandoned window, lit by no visible hand. When storms swept through, people said the light swayed like a lantern carried by someone walking unseen. Then, late in the winter, an old traveler passing through the valley reported something strange. He claimed he had taken shelter in the chapel ruins during a blizzard. Inside, he found the air oddly warm and heavy with the scent of lilies. There, in the flickering of his lantern, he saw two figures standing near the altar, one pale and veiled, the other motionless in the shadows beside her. The traveler said, nothing of faces, only that the woman turned toward him, raised her hand as if in blessing, and the air grew cold enough to frost his breath in an instant. He fled before the storm broke, never returning. By spring, what remained of her story was rumor. The house stood empty, its roof bowed under melting ice. The church sealed the chapel entirely, its door chained shut, though no one spoke of why. Parish records from that season make brief mention of an incident most unnatural, followed by a short entry written in the priest's uneven hand. The union sanctified, both at peace. Years later, when the town modernized and the cemetery was moved, workers found the chapel floor cracked beneath the altar. In the hollow below, they uncovered remnants of candle wax, fragments of lace, and the faint outline of two shapes in the dust, side by side, as though resting. Whether the townspeople truly believed she married the dead, or whether they invented the story to explain what they feared to face, the loneliness, the madness, the devotion that consumes reason, no one could say. But those who stood in that chapel years later all agreed on one thing. Even in daylight, the place seemed dimmer than it should have been, as if some faint light had gone out there long ago and never returned. And when the wind passed through the rafters, it carried a sound that might have been nothing more than air, or perhaps something older, a faint whisper, too soft to understand, repeating vows that no one alive remembered. In the weeks that followed her disappearance, the town seemed to hold its breath. Snow still blanketed the fields, but the air carried a kind of waiting, as if everyone sensed that something had ended, though no one could name what. People spoke quietly, always in fragments. The butcher's wife said she had seen candlelight in the chapel again. The schoolmaster dismissed it as imagination born of grief. The pastor, pale and thin from sleepless nights, refused to enter the churchyard alone. The local paper published a short notice. Unidentified woman missing since December 19th, believed lost to the storm. It ran only once, tucked between announcements for farm tools and rail schedules. Yet the story traveled farther than the printed word. Rumor always did. By February, nearby towns had their own versions. Some said she had exhumed her fiancé's body and taken it home. Others that she had drowned herself, clutching her veil. The truth was simpler and sadder. No one ever found her. The clergy reacted first. The parish priest, who had known her family for years, delivered a sermon on the dangers of false communion with the dead. He warned against seances, against mourning that turned into idolatry. His words trembled at the edges, betraying not authority but fear. He had been the one to find the chapel open that night, the wax still warm. Some said he refused to speak of what he saw there, claiming it was not for mortal tongues to repeat. Doctors from neighboring towns offered explanations more suited to the new century. They called it melancholia, a disease of the nerves. One wrote in a private letter, later preserved by his descendants. The case presents classic symptoms of hysteria, prolonged bereavement, and delusional conviction of continued presence. Another suggested catalepsy, an altered state between life and death brought on by trauma. But none of their words reached the people who had known her. Science could name the sickness, but not the silence it left behind. In that silence, myth took root. Children were told not to wander near the river at dusk. Lovers left tokens at the chapel door for luck, believing her spirit might bless their unions or curse them if forgotten. The boundary between reverence and fear blurred until the two became one. She was spoken of not as a sinner or a saint, but as a warning, a figure who reminded the living that devotion could turn against itself. Some evenings, the town blacksmith would swear he saw her lantern swinging through the fog by the orchard. He would not speak of it in daylight, fearing mockery, yet others admitted the same. A sound like soft fabric brushing stone, a fleeting light, a presence just beyond the edge of sight. Whether real or imagined, it bound the townspeople together in a quiet agreement that whatever had happened was best left undisturbed. The newspapers of New York City heard of the story months later, long after winter had passed. They printed it under titles like Bride of the Dead and Phantom Wedding on the Hudson. The tone was almost mocking, the kind of sensationalism meant to sell copies to readers hungry for the strange. But even through exaggeration, the unease remained. The idea of a woman refusing to accept death in an age obsessed with progress unsettled people. It suggested that beneath their new inventions and their polished society, something ancient still lingered, the old belief that love could defy decay. Scholars from the city's new medical colleges occasionally referenced the case in lectures on mourning psychosis. They spoke clinically, with the confidence of men who had never felt what they described. To them, the woman was a study, not a soul. They theorized about neural exhaustion, grief-induced hallucination, or mass hysteria infecting the town. Yet none of them ever visited the chapel. None heard the quiet shift of wind through its broken roof, or the way the cold seemed to pause there, as if listening. For the families who lived near her house, the memory became part of the land. Her garden never grew again, no matter how many times new owners planted. The soil stayed damp, as if still thawing from some inner frost. In spring, when fog rose from the river, the house would appear and vanish in its folds. Few stayed long. Renters left without explanation, saying only that the nights were too quiet. The pastor who had delivered that first warning sermon fell ill later that year. In his final confession, he was said to have murmured a single phrase, "The union was blessed." His replacement found the parish records incomplete, several pages torn out, others written over in faint script. What remained were dates and half-phrases, notes of rituals performed without witnesses. One entry read, "Both bodies accounted for, yet one grave unfilled." The town's reaction shifted with time. The first generation treated her story as caution, the next as curiosity. By the turn of the century, When electricity replaced gas lamps and telegraphs gave way to telephones, her legend resurfaced as folklore. Writers collected tales of the corpse bride of New York, alongside accounts of haunted bridges and phantom trains. She became a ghost of paper and ink, her sorrow reduced to entertainment. Yet, curiously, those who lived nearest the old chapel refused to speak her name. There were efforts to restore the chapel once. Around 1890, a team of workers arrived with tools and timber intending to rebuild its roof. They left before the week was done. In their report to the town council, they wrote that the foundation was unstable. In private letters, 2 of them described something stranger: tools gone missing, candles relit after being snuffed, and once, a voice that called from beneath the floor, soft, distant, pleading. They refused to return. By then, the world had changed. New York had become a symbol of progress, its skyline climbing higher each year. But in small corners of the state, where fog still clung to the river and the air smelled faintly of iron and damp wood, the old stories remained. The people who kept them alive didn't speak of madness or miracles. They spoke of longing, the kind that outlasts breath. Modern historians would later view the event as a mirror of its age. The 1850s were steeped in contradictions, a society that preached reason yet lived by superstition, that celebrated love yet feared its power. The Bride's Act, whatever its truth, was the culmination of that conflict. She stood between belief and denial, between the comfort of ritual and the terror of loss. Psychologists have since written about grief fixation, where mourning becomes identity, where memory consumes the self. But even through the lens of modern understanding, her story resists neat explanation. The facts are sparse, the witnesses unreliable, the evidence warped by fear and time. What remains is a feeling, a chill that lingers in the telling, as if part of her still waits to be understood. And perhaps that is why her story endures. Because everyone, in some quiet corner of their heart, knows what it means to refuse goodbye. The townspeople who once feared her grew old and died. Their children forgot her name. The chapel fell to ruin, then to dust. But on certain nights when fog rolls down from the river, a faint light still flickers on the hill. Some say it's a reflection from passing trains. Others swear it's a lantern, swaying gently as if carried by a bride still keeping her promise. No one knows the exact hour it happened. The old clock in the church tower had stopped weeks earlier, its gears frozen by the cold. But those who lived near the hill swore the air changed that night, became heavy, like before a storm, though the sky remained clear. The moon hung low, pale as milk, washing the snow in dull silver. The chapel stood like a skeleton, its windows dark, its roof bowed beneath ice. The door, swollen by moisture, gave a long, low groan when pushed open. Inside, time seemed to have stopped long ago. The air was thick with dust, yet there was a scent beneath it, roses and something faintly sweet, like the wax of old candles. She had come alone, walking through the snow in her wedding dress, the hem soaked and gray. Her veil trailed behind her, catching the moonlight like a thread of frost. The lantern in her hand trembled with each breath she took. Inside, her heartbeat was slow and even, as though she had long ago accepted whatever waited for her. No one saw her enter, but years later, the caretaker who found what remained claimed there were 2 sets of footprints, one leading in and one beside it, faint and incomplete, as if half-formed. The chapel was still enough to hear her breath. She moved to the altar where she had once stood with her fiancé, weeks before he fell ill. The same priest, old now and unsteady, was there too. Perhaps she had called for him in her letters. Perhaps he had come out of pity or fear or some unspoken sense of duty. His records would later show a single entry for that night, written in a hand that shook. The rite completed in full witness of God and grave. The candles she had placed burned low, their flames curving toward her like small, desperate things. She set the ring, the one she had retrieved from his grave, upon the altar cloth. Its surface caught the candlelight and threw it back, sharp as glass. The priest began to speak, his voice faltering. The Latin words, long memorized, sounded foreign in the cold. "In death as in life," he said, "you are joined." He paused as if waiting for an answer. Then, from somewhere in the quiet, another voice seemed to echo his words. Not loud, not clear, but present, as if rising from the earth beneath them. She did not flinch. Her eyes, hidden by the veil, fixed on the empty space beside her. And there, the air shifted. A faint mist began to form, a shape that was not a shadow but the memory of one. It gathered slowly, like breath on glass. The priest stumbled back, clutching the cross at his chest. He whispered a prayer meant to drive away spirits, but the words caught in his throat. The bride took a step forward. "I waited," she said softly. "I kept my promise." The candles flickered violently, their flames thinning into blue threads. Outside, the wind began to circle the chapel, rattling the shutters, moaning through cracks in the wood. The snow lifted from the ground and spun like ash. Inside, she raised her hand and placed the ring on her own finger. Something answered. The priest would later tell his confessor, though the words were barely believed, that the light dimmed, though the candles did not go out. It was as if the shadows themselves had thickened, drawn inward toward the altar. He heard the faintest sound then, not of footsteps, but of fabric moving, and the chill deepened until his breath came in pale clouds. He could see, only for a heartbeat, the outline of a man standing beside her. The form was indistinct, fragile, like the impression left by smoke. But the hand that reached for hers was clear, bone pale, trembling. When they touched, the air cracked like ice breaking on a river. The sound rolled through the empty chapel and down the hill, waking the dogs in town. One barked until its voice gave out. The priest fell to his knees, the crucifix slipping from his grasp. He would swear that the last thing he saw before fainting was her veil lifting, slowly, as if caught by invisible fingers, and two shadows merging into one. When dawn came, the chapel stood silent again. The door was shut from within. Those who dared to approach found frost patterns covering the windows, intricate, swirling designs that resembled interlocked hands. The priest was discovered at the altar steps, alive but speechless, his hair gone white. Inside, there was no sign of the bride. No footprints, no veil, no lantern. Only the ring remained, resting on the altar, its surface darkened to a dull, ashen gray. Around it, the melted wax had hardened into shapes that looked almost like faces, their mouths open in mid-breath. The priest was carried back to town. For 3 days he did not speak. When he finally did, his words were simple. The vow was heard. He refused to perform another wedding for the rest of his life. After that night, the chapel was sealed. The church declared it consecrated ground, untouchable. But not everyone obeyed. A group of young men, curious and reckless, broke in months later. What they found was silence thicker than any they had known. One fainted, another vomited. They said the air was cold but alive, as if the space itself remembered. When they fled, one claimed he heard a voice behind him whisper his own name. None of them returned. The town's elders decided to bury the story. They replaced the path to the chapel with new stones, planted rows of trees to hide it from view. The priest's surviving notes were locked in the vestry, where they remained unread for decades. But stories never stay buried in places that old. A century later, historians would rediscover fragments, letters written in the same delicate script, unsigned, each addressed to a single name. The letters spoke of waiting, of the body as a shell, of love as the bridge that death cannot guard. Some bore faint traces of earth and salt water, as if once buried, then dug up again. Modern analysts who examined the ink found something strange. High traces of iron, too much for common pen fluid. Some suggested it was rust, others that it was mixed with blood. Still, the final scene remained unknowable. Whether she stood in that chapel beside a spirit, or a memory, or nothing at all, no one could say. But those who've read the priest's torn entry often point to a single line, written faintly at the bottom. Two shadows passed through the wall, and the air was still. It is said that, after that night, the town's winters grew milder. The fog thinned. But sometimes, on cold evenings, couples walking home from the river would stop mid-conversation, turning toward the hill. They would swear they saw light moving through the trees, a slow, pulsing glow, as if a lantern swung in steady rhythm. Some said it was the bride still walking. Others said it was both of them, hand in hand, bound to the promise they could not undo. Perhaps it was madness. Perhaps it was mercy. But in the hush that follows the telling, there is always that same feeling, the quiet certainty that somewhere, a vow still echoes, And if you stand close enough to that ruined chapel and whisper a promise into the night, you might feel the air change, just slightly, like someone turning toward you in the dark. The chapel on the hill is gone now. What remains are stones half buried in soil, their carvings worn smooth by rain. The path leading there has vanished beneath roots and moss. Only the locals know where it once stood, and even they speak of it carefully, as if naming it too clearly might wake something that has long been quiet. Time erases most things. Buildings fall, records decay, memories soften into rumor. But some stories refuse to disappear. They live in the pauses between words, in the way a silence feels heavier than it should. The story of the bride who married a corpse belongs to that kind of silence. For historians, her tale remains an unfinished equation. The facts, what little exists, are scattered through letters, local archives, and a few fragments of parish records. A wedding certificate with no signatures, a burial record that predates the ceremony, a priest's journal with a final page torn away. Beyond that, only stories passed from voice to voice, each retelling bending the truth a little further toward legend. Some scholars see in it the residue of early 19th century superstition. The rural corners of New York still carried old European customs then, beliefs in omens, in the thin line between death and sleep. Science was young, and medicine was imperfect. People were declared dead when their breath slowed, buried when they might only have been still. To them, the grave was not always an ending, but a door that could open by mistake. Others read it as metaphor, a woman trapped between duty and grief, performing the last ritual that society allowed her, to bind herself to what she had lost. In that century, a woman's place was tethered to marriage. Widowhood was often a social exile. Perhaps in marrying the dead, she was refusing that exile. Perhaps her act was less madness than defiance. In the rare letters believed to be hers, the language shifts between love and theology. She writes of death as a veil, of reunion as sacred duty. If the soul remains, one line says, then the vow must remain also. To break it would be to die twice. No one knows whether these were the words of faith or of someone slipping quietly into delirium. There are whispers of similar customs from that era, posthumous weddings, sanctioned in small rural parishes when a fiancé died before the ceremony. They were rare, secret, and half forbidden, but not unheard of. The church disapproved, yet in some corners, compassion outweighed law. To let a grieving woman complete her vow was thought to ease her soul, even if it could not change what lay in the grave. But none of those rituals match what happened on that hill. No priest ever stood before an empty altar and heard two voices answer one prayer. No other record speaks of light without flame or footprints that faded before dawn. The line between history and haunting dissolves there. Years after the event, travelers through that region still told of strange occurrences. A lantern seen swinging between trees, though no one walked beneath it. Footprints appearing in snow that led nowhere. A soft sound like fabric brushing wood, heard in abandoned barns on windless nights. Farmers dismissed it as imagination, but children, curious and unafraid, whispered that the bride was still looking for warmth. In the 1920s, a group of folklore students from Cornell attempted to trace the legend. They found the site, by then overgrown, and unearthed fragments of scorched metal and glass. Among them was what appeared to be a ring, fused to a lump of iron. They brought it back to their lab, but no analysis could identify its origin. When exposed to heat, the metal emitted a faint fragrance, roses and ash. The object was later lost in a campus fire, its documentation incomplete. Some said it melted away. Even now, locals say that when the first frost falls, a thin fog rises from that patch of land, though no water lies beneath it. The fog doesn't drift. It lingers like breath held too long. Those who pass through describe the same feeling. A quiet pressure behind the ribs, the sense that someone is standing close, listening. To skeptics, it's easy to dismiss such things. Human memory distorts. Fear fills in what the eye cannot explain. Yet legends persist for a reason. They are, in their way, records of emotion, proof that something once mattered enough to refuse silence. Perhaps that is the truest form of haunting, not a spirit, but a feeling that never learned how to rest. And so the story of the bride remains, suspended between faith and myth. In one version, she vanished into the snow, her soul finally joined to his. In another, she was found wandering days later, her mind hollowed by grief, her body pale as candle wax. In yet another, she never existed at all, an invention to explain a single strange phenomenon, a chapel door that locked itself from the inside, but all versions end the same way, with a ring left on an altar, and a silence that hums faintly when spoken of. Standing where that chapel once was, there's nothing now but open air and grass. Yet at dusk, when the wind moves low through the trees, it carries a sound almost like fabric catching on stone. Some say it's only memory, or the echo of time collapsing on itself. Others say it's the veil of a bride that never quite stopped moving. History leaves spaces that facts cannot fill. In those spaces, imagination grows. Maybe that's where she lives now, not as a ghost, but as a question, half-formed and eternal. What does it mean to love someone beyond the limits of the body? To keep a promise even when no one is left to hear it? Perhaps that is what haunts us most. Not the dead, but the living, reaching toward what cannot reach back. And somewhere, beneath centuries of dirt and roots, a faint shimmer of metal might still rest in the earth. A ring dulled with time, waiting for a hand that no longer exists. If you listen long enough, the wind might tell you the rest. But it never does. It only sighs and moves on.